I wanted to make sure I knew Norris's name. Wasn't that great? And the worship team, what a delight. And I want a copy of that introduction. That's going to go on the road. That's as good as I've ever seen. So let me know when I'm out of time. My phone's on the ground. What a blessing to be with you. And there you go. Thank you. And to share with you this morning truth that has really had an impact in my life. One correction, I now have 5 grandchildren. And my newest grandchild is 10 months old. When he went for his 6-month checkup, they said, your child is normal weight if he was 16 months old. He was crawling on the kitchen floor not long ago. He saw his reflection in the refrigerator thing, the metallic thing, and he looked at that and he crawled up to that reflection and started kissing that reflection. And I told my daughter-in-law, you're not going to have to worry about self-image. I think he's going to be okay. But you really better focus on humility. I think that could be an issue for him. This morning I'm going to focus on something that God has been working into my life the last several years. And somewhere in the singing this morning, we were reminded that God doesn't waste any of it. He's working. He's always working. And we're going to talk about grieving. As the introduction mentioned, my dear wife went to be with the Lord in March of 2018, March of 2018. She had had almost 2 years of just catastrophic illness. And so we started grieving a couple of years before she died because of the traumas that were a part of that very painful experience, both physical and mental illness. And in the midst of that, I began to learn some things about grieving that I had read about but really didn't understand. And so this morning, I want to tell you, every person in this room has or will experience something that will cause you to grieve. When you don't make the baseball team, that's a loss. And a kid needs to learn how to deal with that hurt. As you get older, you don't get the job you wanted or you lose the job you loved. You don't date the girl you wanted to spend time with, or the marriage you were in blows up. If you live a normal life, your parents will die. And if you're married, one of you is going to go to heaven, hopefully, and the other is going to be left here working through the grieving process. It is a universal reality. And so I'm talking to you today out of a learning curve that I'm still on when it comes to grieving. I want to read 3 verses. These verses give us biblical truth. We've sung about the goodness of God this morning. We've talked about how God is strong. And let me just read some of these verses. It says in Psalm 34:18, the Lord is near the brokenhearted and save those who are crushed in spirit. When my wife died, my 2 children and I were crushed in spirit. And the Lord was close. He is good. It says in Psalm 37:23 and 24, the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. When he falls down, he will not be hurled headlong, because the Lord is the one who holds his hand. Every one of my grandchildren, that little 10-month-old that's pushing that little cart around, he starts with basically the thing that all of us end up with as we walk in our last days, holding on to that walker. And so he can handle life with a walker, but sometime soon he's going to start walking, and we're going to go walking. I've done it with all of them. And when we're walking on the road, on the sidewalk, I've got them by the hand. Now, there's a chance that they could scrape their toe or maybe even their knee, but the thing that's never going to happen when Papa's with them is they're never going to crack their skull. Because I'm strong enough to make sure that no matter what they do, they can't get away from me. They may try, They may cry, they may whine, but they won't get away because I won't let go. That's the picture in Psalm 37. God's not going to let go. He's strong. He's strong enough to hold you. Now, when you're disobedient to Him, He'll have to discipline you, and that's no fun. I know that firsthand. God is good. God is strong. And one other verse that's just amazing, and I hope that this will help you listen today, because God is wise enough and discerning enough to know that as He comforts you, He's really preparing you to be a part of His comfort for others. He does not waste any of it. It's found in 2 Corinthians 1. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we are able to comfort those in any affliction." So that whatever you're going through, whatever you've been through, God's helped you through that so you can be His instrument of blessing to people that are grieving. Now, those are three biblical anchors in the bedrock of a faithful and loving and sovereign God. Let's talk about grieving. First of all, you and I need to grasp the complexity and the simplicity of the grieving process. You've ever heard of the stages of grief? It makes it sound like it's a pretty common, normal pattern that you go through. But really, grieving is a chaotic series of repeated experiences, not a sequence of common stages. It's more like a jungle than a path. Do you have that graphic of the stages of grief that you can put up there? There you go. You see, the roadmap that the books often tell you is you go through denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and then acceptance. And you do all those things, but you don't do it in a sequence like that. In fact, you go back to denial 100 times. You go back to anger over and over again. You go back to depression many times. It is the picture that you see with all the scribbly marks. That's what grieving's like. Grieving is not something that you can sort of handle because you say, well, I'm glad I got the anger behind me. It's not a sequence. It's a confusing jungle. And in the midst of that reality, catastrophic loss unleashes an interconnected matrix of these experiences. One of the things I discovered is that when my wife died, I was in a deep and difficult and dark time of grieving. I was numb for a long time. But I realized that I met my wife when I was 30 years old. I had a well-established relationship with God before she even became a beautiful part of my life. And so when she left planet Earth and went to heaven, I was shaken to the core. But I had a reference point beyond my relationship with her that made my grieving painful, but not nearly as confusing as it was for my two children, because they had never known a moment of life without their mom. We discovered that she had some medical issues, some mental illness, some frontal lobe dementia that was a part of that. And they told us at the very end, after she had had her third suicide attempt, and there was bleeding in her brain, and they said, we can't stop the bleeding. And the guy down at John Speedersmith in charge of the emergency room said, Mr. Horton, if we had known everything 2 years ago when she first started showing these symptoms that we know this morning, we could not have done anything different. We can tell you that it's abnormal in that part of the brain. These are the terms he used that control motivation, decision-making, and impulse control. And the truth is, my wife experienced those things, but it was intermittent. Part of every day, she seemed to be okay, and then she'd be back in the bed in her fetal position saying, why God won't God let me die? There were hallucinations. There were all kinds of bizarre things. And her one request every day was, don't let them put me back in a hospital. So she was not willing to tell the psychiatrist what was really going on, because she knew if he knew what was happening, they would put her in a hospital. And that's exactly what the doctor, John Peterson, said. If we had known then what we know now, we couldn't have helped her any other way other than to prepare you and your family to put her in a facility where she could be restrained so she couldn't hurt herself. Every time she asked me, when she'd say, don't let them put me back in a hospital, I could say, honey, I'm not going to let them do that unless you try to hurt yourself again. If I had known the truth, I'd have had to lie to her. Have you ever tried to lie to your wife? Even in the midst of mental disease, she'd have known I was lying. So I said, God, you were good. I didn't know the truth. I didn't know the truth. So in the midst of that kind of trauma, I discovered that every person in the circle of grief has a different experience. And so in the midst of helping people through that, gentle questions and careful listening are essential. It's critical that we make sure they don't get any hint from us that we understand what they're going through. Even though I've gone through this trauma, if you have a suicide in your family or the death of a loved one, I can't say I know what you're going through. All I can say is that I do know God can help us, and He wants to help you. And that's the starting point for God working with us in the midst of catastrophic loss. You see, gentle questions, careful listening, will help the person on the path of hurting, honesty, healing, and hope. Great loss causes great pain. And it's not going to go away quickly. And as you work through the great pain, hopefully in a circle of people who love you and care for you, in a church family like this, as you work through great pain, that hurt, you got to be honest. My kids came to me a few months after their mom had taken her life, and they said, Dad, we're so mad at Mom. We're so mad at her. Why did she do that? And we had talked through her mental illness. They knew that cognitively, but it was not reaching their soul. And I said, honey, I'm so sad that you're hurting. I'm so sad that you're angry. But if you came and told me you weren't angry, I would really be concerned. Because anger is the human response to hurt. And one of the greatest lessons you can help your children learn is how to deal with anger. Anger is inevitable because we live in a hurtful world. And so that process of dealing with anger is found in Ephesians chapter 4. It's basically you have to forgive the other person unconditionally. The starting point is because Christ forgave me, I forgive them. Doesn't mean that what they did wasn't awful. Doesn't mean that what they did doesn't have consequences in terms of how you trust them. You don't have to show up for more beatings over and over again, but you can forgive them unconditionally because Christ has forgiven you completely. And guess what Christ has done? He's already paid for their sin that they committed against you. Based totally and completely upon what Christ has done, we can forgive them. And then in chapter 4, verse 25 and 26, it says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Do it promptly. One time we were having a conflict. I brought that verse out, so I thought that would help us get over the edge. My dear Kathy says, don't you quote scripture to me. My sun's not going to go down for several days. I said, okay, I understand. Anybody, some of you ladies, do you notice the ladies are laughing at that more than the men? I don't know why that's the case. But deal with it as promptly as you can. And then in verse 15 it says, be honest in love. You start with forgiveness. You are ready to work through it as soon as the other person is willing to do it. And then you're honest. I messed up. This is why I was hurt. And you begin to work through what really happened so that you can experience the healing. So you have the blessing of hurting, the hardship of hurting, the wisdom of honesty, the blessing of God's healing. He is a healer. He does heal. And as the healing grows, the hope begins to blossom again. It's been almost 6 years now. 7.5 years since we realized my wife had something terribly wrong with the way she was dealing with life. And there is hope. Hope that I'm going to be with her in heaven. And she's already experiencing what you helped us understand this morning. I wake up every morning, I say, she's in heaven. Nobody who's ever been there volunteered to come back. I think Lazarus was sort of ticked that he had to make it back and die again. I don't know that, but I'd like to ask you, how did you feel when you had to come out of that? And if my dear wife could come back, even to see those beautiful grandbabies, she wouldn't do it. So she's happy. She's got it. Now, God, you got her in your arms. You're going to have to help me today. You have to help me another day. There's hope. There's hope that comes because we have already won the victory, as we sang early. And we've won it because we're in Christ. He has the victory. One of the things that you need to know about grieving is that it is a lonely and painful and exhausting experience. We have the opportunity to be surrounded by people who help us, but nobody can grieve for you. I couldn't grieve for my kids. They couldn't grieve for me. And in that reality, that grieving and healing process is a time of reflection and tears, and you need extra rest. When my father died 30 years ago, I took a nap 4 or 5 days a week for about 6 months. We were very close. I just was worn out. Give yourself room. Give yourself the freedom to say, I can't go at a full pace until I begin to get the healing that only God can give me. Now, you got to do what you got to do. You got to do your job. I understand that, but you don't have to take on more and more opportunities until you're at a healthier and restored place. One thing I want you to understand about this grieving process is that it simply doesn't allow for shortcuts. Something happens terrible, and you say, I'm going to start me a new master's program. You lose a wife or a husband and says, I'm going to go to a dating app and find me another person. When you try to take a shortcut, you are setting yourself up, in most cases, for a longer and more painful and more destructive grieving experience. You're going to create more hurt on top of the hurt you've already experienced. Now, I've had people as a pastor come to me and say, my wife died 6 months ago, should I get remarried? And I've always said, wait at least a year. Now, there was one couple who were going to get remarried after about 4 months, and I said, don't do it, don't do it. They were happily married for 20 years, so only God knows. But I will say this, it's a rare situation where you're ready to move from whatever the dynamics were of your first marriage to the realities of a second marriage. Here's the great lie. It's going to be easier this next time. I'm experienced. your experience with one person with all the certain weakness and strength that you got used to and you were able to accommodate and sort out and figure out. And you marry another person who's assuming you're like their first spouse, and they're assuming you're like their first spouse. Now, that's a formula for a lot of hard work. Now, it may be worth it, but simple is not going to be how you would describe that. I think it's more complicated than even the first marriage. And God blesses second marriages. But don't foolishly assume I'm an expert at this now. This is going to be easier this time. I'm convinced it'll be harder. It may be even more blessed, but it will not be easier. I want to say one other thing. After you've gone through the initial trauma, you're sort of in shock, you're numb for a few months, and then you begin to work through all the anger and the hurt, and then you begin to get to a little bit healthier place. Months, even years later, you can be going along thinking, I'm moving, this is working for me now. You can be ambushed. I was going to meet one time with Dr. Mark Bailey, the president of Dallas Seminary. I was on the board and I needed to talk to him about something. And we were going to meet in Arlington, and I drove up to the restaurant, and there was a place that my wife used to go with friends. It was a cosmetic jewelry place over there in South Arlington. Some of you ladies may know about it. Don't have to tell your husband you know about it. But I saw that sign. I'd never been there, but I'd heard my wife talk about it. And I had to pull into that restaurant parking lot. And about 10 minutes after I was supposed to be there, Mark called and says, "Are you coming?" I said, "I'm here, and I'm going to be in just a minute." Because I just was overwhelmed with sadness just by seeing that sign. I wasn't thinking about, but it was like an ambush. It was a spontaneous combustion. People would come to me in the aftermath of Kathy's death and says, "Are you able to have lunch with people now?" I said, "Absolutely, as long as you're okay with a grown man crying." Because I really don't know when it's going to happen. You got to give yourself permission to cry. And people who are really friends are going to say it's going to be okay. Come on. I can handle a grown man or a grown woman crying. Those kinds of processes, God is going to help you work through it, and you're going to cry as much as you need to cry. And you sort of don't know how much that's going to be or when it's going to happen. Now, one of the other things I learned is we had a grandchild who had just been born when Kathy died, and we had another grandson born not long ago. When something is really good for your family, it's going to be really hard. Because you're going to say, "Wouldn't Kathy love to see this? Wouldn't she love to see this big old hunk of a boy?" When he was born, 9 pounds, 12 ounces, 22 inches, big kid. So I went by to see him and see my son and his wife, and then the mother, my daughter-in-law's mother and her husband were going to come by, and I was going to take my 2 grandsons to get a hamburger. Just a side note, make sure you know exactly what they want on the hamburger before you get to the restaurant. If we'd had a videotape, that would have been the beginning of a show, action drama or something. But anyway, on the way there, my 5-year-old said, "Papa, Johnny won't ever get to meet Gigi." I'm thinking, boy, I didn't bargain on that this morning. And of course, Sam had met Gigi because he was an infant and he had pictures of her holding him, but he wasn't aware of that. He was 4, 5, 6 months when she died. But he'd seen a picture. The older one, Jacob, had a little more of a memory of his Gigi. And I said, "Well, boys, are you going to get to spend more time with Gigi?" I don't know. They've been hearing the gospel. They're sinners, just like all your grandchildren are. You don't have to cheat them. You don't have to teach them to hit, to steal, to lie. None of that has to be taught. It just happens. You have 2 or 3 boys in a room and something breaks. When you come in, what is always true? They're pointing at each other, right? It's never... My dad used to spank all of us. He said, I'm going to get the guilty one and the rest of them need one just for general purposes. Which is not a bad strategy if you got more than two boys, let me tell you. But anyway, so they've heard the gospel, the older one. They're getting them to a place where they can hopefully trust Christ. And I said, well, are you going to? And they said, well, we don't know. I said, well, if you trust Jesus, your mom and dad have been explaining that to you. If you trust Jesus and He forgives your sin, you're going to go to heaven just like your Gigi did, and you're going to have all the time you could want with her. And he went back to his real, but Johnny never met Gigi. I said, well, so Johnny is just a little baby. He hadn't done anything wrong that we know of yet. But as he grows up, who's going to tell him about Jesus? Well, Mommy and Daddy. I said, well, that's true. I'm sure of that. But what about you? When you're 9 or 10 years old and you do know Jesus, are you going to have a chance to explain that to little Johnny? Well, I hadn't thought of that. And I said, I understand. So what would happen if you got a chance to explain how little Johnny could trust Jesus and he trusts Jesus? What's going to happen when he dies? He's going to go to heaven. I said, you make sure Johnny has all the time he wants with Gigi. And if he trusts Jesus, he'll have all he could ever hope for. My point is, those kinds of conversations become the context of sorting through the various ambushes of life. Now, I want to give you 3 steps and that you get to be a part of. God's going to do His part. He's going to comfort you. He is going to be close to you. He's going to be strong for you. And He's going to prepare you to be useful to Him with other people. And as He does that, you will discover, whatever your hurt is, you live in a world full of people who've had a similar hurt. Once people found out my wife had committed suicide, had people coming out of the woodwork wanting to talk about it. Now, I was really careful. I said, look, I don't know what you've gone through. I don't know about all that happened for you. I can just say, here's a couple of things that I've had to learn the hard way. Here's what I've discovered. I can't rush it. I did discover that if you give yourself room to think about it, you can actually embrace the grieving experience. I read a book, and it was a worthless book except for one paragraph. When something like this happens, people start sending you books, right? And it was worthless. But one place in that process, it says, being around the sound of water is often helpful to people. And their rationale was, you and I start in a sack of water, right? And I thought, well, I'm going to try that. So I went to Colorado and I walked along the river 4 miles every day. And that river stream, and I'd listen to the funeral service again, and I'd look at the video of her pictures. And guess what happened every time I did that? Cried like a baby. But I said, I'm not pulling back. I'm going to keep crying until I finally get to a place where I can say, God, thank you for my wife. Now, I don't know how that really helped, but I do know this. I was at a healthier place after a year than I thought I would be. Didn't mean I didn't get ambushed. It meant I had embraced the reality of grieving and the healing process in the midst of that jungle that we have up on the screen. The healing process seemed to be moving forward in a way that was not stuck along the path. And so you and I get a chance to be involved in and walking on the ocean. Kathy loved the ocean. And so if that's true for you, if those are experiences you've had with someone you love, If you love going fishing with your spouse, maybe fishing would be part of it. Just as long as you give yourself full permission to cry whenever you want to. So how will God use you? I want to just mention several things. You need to initiate care on the front end. You need to say, I'm available to help. Don't say I understand, because you don't. I'm here. When you need me, call me. You can comfort wisely by not assuming you know what they're going through, by being honest that you've had a similar experience, but it's different because it's different for every person, and that you're available to listen. I would always tell people, you're going to get angry. Oh, I'm not going to be angry. Yes, you are. And I said, if you need to go west of town out in Parker County and yell and scream and cuss, I'll go with you and sit on the hood and just pray for you while you go through that. Because anger is the human response to hurt. And the death of a child or the death of a spouse is, the death of a parent is incredibly hurtful and painful and hard. And so you need to give them wisdom. You need to be there for them without trying to explain it to them. You need to support practically. One of the questions I always would ask as a pastor, who's the person you can call when you are at a really hard place and you got to talk to somebody right now? And you need to have 2 or 3 of those people. That when you need to talk to somebody at 3 o'clock, they're not going to be mad at you for calling at 3 o'clock. Because when you really need to talk to somebody, there needs to be some people available for you. Who's helping you at the very beginning with the service? Getting people to rally and making sure they know that there are people that can help them is going to be a critical part of that process. And then you need to encourage them biblically. What's the question people ask when something terrible happens? Something awful, something you would never imagine? Because my wife was the happiest person I'd ever met. I used to say, I made the plan, she brought the fun. And here she is, she's in heaven because she took her own life. And so, what's the question we ask? Why? Who else asked why? Did Habakkuk ask why? Yeah. Why are you letting these Chaldeans, these wicked people? Did David ask why? Did Job ask why? And there's lots more. Did God ever answer why? Not that I can tell. In fact, Job at the end of his book says, I wish I hadn't brought it up. Now, don't feel bad if you ask why, because you're in good company. Everybody asks why. But don't be surprised if God doesn't answer that question. I think for the most part, because we couldn't handle why. Officer and a gentleman, you can't handle the truth. Well, you and I just aren't able to handle why, right? It's just too, it's bigger than us. So in the midst of our longing for why, what does the Bible offer us that's rock solid and steady and a blessing for us in the midst of the worst of all of life's circumstances? His Word. But what does His Word tell us? It tells us not why did God let this happen, but who God is. You focus on who God is. He is a loving, faithful, good, just, sovereign God. I understand and embrace God's sovereignty more now after my wife's death than before. And it's a place of refuge. God knew before she was ever born, God knew before the foundation of the earth that my dear wife was going to have a brain that would begin to deteriorate, so that in her mid-60s, she changed from a happy person to a person desperate to leave this earth. So much so that she tried 3 times, and all 3 were just awful, dramatic, catastrophic experiences. And in every one of them, there was evidences of God being there in the midst of that. Extending her life just a little bit longer so she could hold at least that third grandson. And so we know who God is. And when we latch on to who God is, we'll begin to see what He's doing. Because He is doing something that will allow us to be even more useful to Him. He does not waste our pain. And you, if you go through hardship, and you will, and most everybody in this room has, you have capacity to be a blessing to your children and grandchildren and family and friends. You are a well-prepared instrument of comfort in a way that you just couldn't be if everything had always been hunky-dory. Not why, but who is God and what is He doing? And the Father is always working. He's always working. Now, you need to encourage participation in a grief support process. I had guys I was discipling, guys I'd gotten close to. I kept meeting with them throughout this whole process. My son said, Dad, you need to go to a grief support system. I said, I'm meeting with about 6 guys a week, and we're talking about this every time we meet. They know Kathy, they know me. I'm having these conversations. And the thought of having strangers talk about me and my wife just doesn't quite work for me. Now, it doesn't mean that those things are great for most people. I just was in a different situation. And so my grief support was with the guys I was discipling and guys I discipled years before. And they were with me, and they were really comfortable with me crying. Gave me a chance to talk about it with a lot of different people. That was really helpful. But every person needs an environment where they can talk about their anger, their sadness, their gratitude for that person that is no longer with them, with freedom and without concern about evaluation or critique. We need to encourage people to be proactive as they go through the grieving process and be ready to respond when that person they love needs help. We need to help a person work through anger, because anger is the human response to hurt. And that's not the purpose of this sermon. When I go around the world, whether it's Cuba or Mongolia or Turkey, they often say, you got 1 hour left, 1 extra hour, what do you want to talk about? And I said, let's talk about anger. How to deal with anger. And they say, oh, okay. Sort of strange. But about 5 minutes into that conversation, everybody in the room, no matter what culture they're from, they're on the front of their seat, because every person on planet Earth deals with anger. Because you've been hurt. People disappoint you. And if you don't deal with anger well, you're going to hold it yourself, right? You're going to stuff it. You're going to suppress it. See, Christians say, well, if you can suppress it and control it, that's good. No. That's bad, because it's going to poison you. It's drinking the poison and thinking it's hurting the other person. And so suppression is an awful way to deal with anger. Explosion. Anybody in here? Now, if you're suppressed long enough, you'll explode, but at the strangest times, they're saying, man, that guy exploded, and we have no idea why. But a guy who has explosive anger, you don't have any question about why, because he's going to tell you why he's going to explode before he explodes, right? Suppression, explosion, awful for relationships. The third, and I won't deal with this, but if you're in a business or an organization, you know this, passive-aggressive behavior. They are angry. They clear up problems. They, cause confusion. And you say, are you angry? You upset? Oh, no, I'm not angry. I'm just enjoying watching all this turmoil that I create. And I often ask businessmen, how many passive-aggressive people does it take to really undermine any church or business or family? Just one. Just one. It's awful. And those unhealthy ways of dealing with anger, there's a healthy way. Forgive, and as promptly as possible, have an honest conversation. And with God's help, hopefully build a new pattern. And if they're not willing to build a new pattern, It's okay to forgive them and pray for them, but pull back and you don't have to trust them. Trust is not the same as forgiveness, right? And there's some people I decided, I don't think I'm going to spend much more time with that because it just never works out well. I'm bad for them. I'm going to pull back. Making sense? Now, one other thing. You need to prepare the path for grieving and healing. And you do this by reminding them that the only way forward is through the abyss. That's a quote from Jerry Sitzer in a book called A Grace Disguised. You cannot avoid it. You can only go through it. And as you allow God to help you, as you embrace the memory of the one who's gone, the picture is that it's like a place where the tree has been cut off at the ground, and all you got's a stump left. Has anybody ever tried to remove a stump? How'd that work for you? Short of dynamite, it's not going to be very good, and that creates its own set of issues, right? When someone dies, there's going to be a stump in your life the rest of your life. My wife was such a blessing to us. And what you do around that stump, the flowers, the garden, the remembrance of the beautiful tree she was and the beautiful tree she is now, more glorious than ever, what you do about that will give you a chance to reach a place where your gratitude for the person you loved grows and grows and grows. And I'll close with this. I've gone too long. But I often hear guys talking about their spouses. And these two guys were in Colorado. They were at a pool, and they were talking about the 25th anniversary. They were there at the resort to treat their wives. They're both having 25th anniversaries. and I'm about 10 or 15 feet away, but I couldn't help but hear them talking about all their plans. And I finally said, guys, I am so excited to hear about what you're going to do with your wives tonight, and all the fun you're going to have. I said, I'm going to say something to you, and you don't have to agree with me, but I'm almost certain that I'm correct about this, because it was true about me. I didn't know anybody who appreciated their wife more than I did. I mean, I was 32 before I got married. I never got over how great it was to be married. And I said, you obviously love your wives, and it's a blessing to hear about it. But I'm going to tell you something. No matter how much you appreciate your wife, you don't appreciate her enough. Because you won't ever appreciate her enough until you don't have her. Now, I didn't know this, but their wives were about 10 feet the other way. And they probably didn't handle this well. They started cheering and yelling and clapping and stuff. So I'm not sure I helped the husbands. I may have drawn the wives into sin, but that's another story. But the more you're able to allow God to beautify the place of loss that's never going away, the more you'll be able to be grateful for the spouse, the parent, the child, whoever God has taken out of your life. And you'll be able to do that in a way that will allow you to be a blessing to others. Because that's what God's doing in this world. He's equipping Christians to bless other people in the midst of a world where everybody's going to get hurt. Let me pray. Father, thanks for this time. Use these truths. In Christ's name, amen.